Will Facebook follow through with its threat to ban Aussies from sharing news articles?
And have folding phones come of age with Samsung's Galaxy Z Fold 2?
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. Hi there, welcome to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the weekly podcast where we sneak across the state borders to catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists and get the stories behind the tech news of the week. I'm Adam Turner, locked down in Melbourne, and I'm joined as always by our Sydney-sider Alex Kidman, a man who remembers when the height of Facebook's powers was being able to poke your friends. Alex, have you poked anyone recently?
Look, that's a deeply personal question, Adam, and in these socially distant times, perhaps a bit of Facebook poking is all the action some of us can get.
True. What a man does in the privacy of his own home is none of my business. But this week, we're crossing the state borders again, as I said. We're going all up and down the eastern seaboard. We're joined by the gadget queen and longtime friend of the show, News Corp national tech editor, Jen Dudley-Nicholson. Jen, how goes it north of the wall?
You know what? It's sunny and pretty, and you can't count me. I'm sorry.
But we'll pretend to be Queenslanders. I can pretend to like rugby.
Oh, look, and I can pretend to like AFL, apparently.
Let's not even talk about that. Now that they're having a night grand final, that's it. Like, the floodgates are open. You've ruined it for everybody, damn it.
Oh, man, I just got here.
Look, I don't even understand what this sports thing is. I feel like I should get this podcast back on track. So, this week, instead of talking about sports, we're coming to grips with Samsung's latest folding smartphone, unleashed virtually where in any other year it would have made its debut at IFA in Berlin. So, meanwhile, and while Adam pines for a pint of Dunkel Gold from the Hofbrauhaus, Facebook is threatening to go to war with the Australian media. Herr Turner, what is Zuckerberg's battle plan?
Well, as we've previously discussed, there's an ongoing battle between the ACCC and the online giants Google and Facebook, because the ACCC basically wants them to pay Australian media outlets because Google and Facebook supposedly benefit from sharing news items. Now, the fact that that's not extended to the public broadcasters like the ABC is a whole different thing that makes me really cross, and we can discuss it another time. But so when that came along a couple of weeks ago, Google went on a big PR offensive and basically made up a lot of rubbish. It was just scare tactics, really. And they didn't, I don't think personally, they helped their cause very much. And Facebook stayed very quiet, assumingly because they wanted two bites of the cherry, make the headlines themselves. And now they've done it because they've come out and said, if you don't change this, then no one in Australia will be allowed to share media articles online. On Facebook. And to kind of make their point, they didn't even talk to the Australian media. They just told the US media and let us find out the hard way. Now, Jen, does Facebook have a point here? Are they just throwing their weight around? Should we take this seriously?
Look, I'll be fascinated to see whether they go ahead with this, because I think most people could have guessed that there was some kind of threat from them coming. It was very surprising to me when we saw Google kind of, throw up a big tanty about this, which, you kind of expected, but not quite in the same way that they did it. They seem to be really targeting their YouTube audience, for example, which was interesting. So we always kind of expected that Facebook's campaign against this law was coming. They say that they're okay with paying for news, but they only want to do that on their own terms, in their own way, for as much money as they think is relevant, which, according to their submissions to the ACCC so far, is not very much.
Although the way the code works, to a certain extent, Facebook had two models it could pursue. It could either pursue the negotiation phrasing, which in Facebook's world it thinks is unbalanced, and we might discuss that in a moment, or it could go nuclear, and it's chosen to go nuclear. There wasn't really a middle ground, I think, that they could go with this, because they've either got to pay for news, which is what the code says, or they've got to stop having news from Australians on their service, which is the way they're going, or the way they've said they're going to go.
It is a really interesting argument, though, to be saying on Facebook's behalf, no, we're not going to have any news content at all, because they are a company, and I'm not sure if you've noticed this, who is really well known for spreading misinformation. if you have a look at how many 5G conspiracy theories there are and where they've come from, a lot of them, I assume you will find out, have actually come from Facebook posts. And just based on the number of crazy, zany conspiracy theories I see from people that I used to go to school with or from people I'm related to, which is disturbing, um, like there's a lot of misinformation there. And to be able to not to post any kind of news, beneath the crazy stuff that goes on there, I think could be a really big issue for Facebook ultimately.
But does Facebook actually publish the news? So this is the thing. Does Facebook actually itself publish an article that I wrote for the Age or that you wrote for the Courier Mail, or does the newspaper put it on their website, or does a person like I don't see how Facebook is considered to be the publisher here. How does that work?
Well, Facebook have long tried to argue against this idea that they are a publisher. Absolutely. It's really interesting the way that the ACCC has tackled this, because lots of other countries have tackled it from a copyright perspective and said that companies like Google and Facebook are using the copyright of others. But what the ACCC has said is these companies are so large, they are so dominant in digital advertising that essentially newspapers cannot not work with them. They are unavoidable trading partners. They have to publish their stories on them in order to get traffic, because they dominate the digital advertising market. And so what they're saying is, by having these products, these parts of journalism all over their network, they're essentially making their network more sticky. They're benefiting financially out of this, and they're not sharing any of that revenue. I think it's a really interesting way to do it, and I think the ACCC built in a lot of ways to make sure that they weren't just going to change their algorithm a bit, that they weren't going to be able to weasel out of this. So the only way they're going to be able to do it, Facebook, is to eliminate all news on their platform. And I don't even know, and I don't think they know yet, what that actually encompasses, because that could be not just news stories and news links as we all create, but also potentially photos that have been taken by professional photographers, and videos from Channel 7 News or what have you, maybe text that is copied. I mean, how does that affect past posts? Are they all going to be removed too? There's still a lot of unknowns about this proposal that they're saying that they're taking reluctantly.
Look, it's kind of interesting as well, because the code as proposed only affects large media businesses. And obviously, Jen, you're working for one of the two biggest.
It actually doesn't, though. It actually affects anyone with any media businesses that has a turnover of $150,000 or more, which is potentially a lot of regional news places.
Yeah, that's quite small, really.
To be fair, there aren't a lot of regional newspapers that are not owned by Nine or by News.
You'd be surprised, and there's more of them coming up.
But I know, look, I take your point, but the point I'm trying to make is there's an element to which I agree. It becomes this interesting thing of how do you define what news is, and if I publish something personally on one of my own personal sites, then does that qualify as news or not? Or if I'm writing it for a bigger publisher, obviously it is. Can that be shared? Are they just going to IP block? You're right. It's kind of messy, and it does bring up, as you were saying before, in fact, this other issue of fake news. I randomly happen to have to end up on Facebook, on the Facebook page of a very prominent, sorry to say this, Jen, Queensland politician, and
I take no responsibility.
I won't name names because Australian libel laws are kind of nasty, but it was full of a lot of crackpot stuff. But it was all from these news outlets I'd never heard of before, and who I suspect probably aren't booking 150K in revenue in Australia.
Yeah, there's a much bigger issue for Facebook behind all of this, around some of the fake news, and also some of the fake even advertisements that we've been seeing come up a lot recently. I think to balance that out, it's nice to have some news on their platform, and they've really sort of thrown everything out of the cart, out of the pram with this proposal that they're putting forward, because they're saying, well, in other places we intend to pay for news, and in other places we intend to create this special news tab in the news feed, and Facebook is going to value news in other markets but not Australia. So it really feels like we're being left out in the cold. And as Adam said, like, it was interesting to see that no Australian journalist received any briefing about this. It was just a big press release dropped at 10 a.m. and good luck with that, Chief.
Mm.
I think the key thing there really was that ultimately, I don't think this is about Australia at all. The reason that Facebook went out and talked to US journalists is because it's not, I think, not that it's unconcerned with its Australian revenues, but its Australian revenues are a drop in the bucket, relatively speaking, in world terms. What it wants to do is cut off this kind of proposal, which is definitely being watched overseas, from spreading elsewhere, from it costing it more money than it otherwise would. I mean, we discussed the actual proposal itself a couple of weeks ago on the show, and I think there are some problems on both sides of the equation, to be honest. But clearly, Facebook is going nuclear here to try and make it clear elsewhere, hey, don't even start doing this.
It's like they're coming down very hard on their problem child, but I don't necessarily see us as a problem child. It's look, I understand that they don't want a worldwide precedent to be set, but at the same time, I don't think that they can completely argue that they're all for journalism and they're all for supporting, rigorous, public interest journalism, and at the same time go, yeah, none of it's going to be on our platform. You cannot share a skerrick.
At least you've got to respect. I respect Facebook's approach to this much more than Google, because Google came out with all this rubbish scare campaign where Facebook just came out and actually said, right, well, then we'll do what we have to do. Facebook has threatened to do something realistic and explain what it is, where Google said that, the pixies are going to come and steal your lunch. Like, at least do you know what I mean? Like, at least Facebook has said, right, if you want to play it that way, that's how it's going to be. Because this is basically what the ACCC has said to them they have to do if they won't make a deal. So they're just calling their bluff.
I don't necessarily think it is a practical solution. I think it's going to be very difficult for Facebook to implement. However, I do agree that it's completely a straightforward solution, and you know exactly where they stand, and there's absolutely no subtlety here. YouTube's was really interesting, especially with some of the messaging that they gave to YouTube creators. And it was very much, it was not necessarily focused on the idea of paying for news, well, also that, but the idea of paying for news, and it was more about the algorithm is at risk, YouTube is at risk, our free services are at risk. When if you actually look at the proposal and the draft law, that's not what that says. There's some parts of it that actually say that YouTube and Google and Facebook, they have to give a heads up when there's a significant change to the way that the news will be presented on their platforms. And that's just because in the past, they made massive changes that no one was prepared for. And it made a big difference to news publishers in particular. That's not about giving anyone a competitive advantage. The law also says that they need to give some information about what information they collect from their consumers. And that's primarily to help out smaller publishers, like we talked about, like those regional publishers who probably don't know that they can get information about how long people are spending on articles, for example. Whereas the big publishers like 9/7 and my employer, they already have that information down. They know how to access information about, which stories are most popular. That's about helping small publishers who want to get online. And YouTube is certainly, and Google is certainly not making that evident and is not making the idea behind it available to anyone.
Look, I don't know that I agree with you on the first point there, Jen, around the algorithm and making changes apparent. I think it's 28 days before they're implemented. If only because in an awful lot of cases, and you'd be well aware of this, there's a massive cat and mouse SEO game going on where people are trying to get more eyeballs, more attention. And that's undeniably, that's much more a Google thing than a Facebook thing, but it still happens.
And it's an industry in itself. That is an industry in itself.
Yeah. And giving an angle and an advantage to a set of media publishers above a certain threshold, that does not sit well with me. I don't see how that's an advantage to everyday consumers. I totally see how it's an advantage to the media providers, though.
Look, feel free to take it from the ACCC. I don't want to talk on their behalf, but I think what it's based on is this idea that they don't want Facebook and Google, who are clearly very opposed to parts of this deal, depending on what they're saying at that particular time. they don't want them to disadvantage news publishers, for example. They don't want them to all of a sudden make news disappear online just because they're having a bit of a hissy fit, which is what may happen with Facebook anyway.
Well, that's fine, but then I think you craft that law in a very specific way. As it stands, as the proposal is in the draft, it just talks about changes that could affect the ranking of news. And that's an incredibly broad statement to make. That would be delivering an awful lot of SEO information under could, not so much under may bias against. I take your point, though.
I mean, it's a warning. It's not information about how the algorithm is going to change or how you can avoid it or anything. It's a 28-day heads up that something is going to change. I honestly don't think that that was their design, certainly, and maybe they need to have some more specific wording around this. It is in a draft form, for example. The submissions to that draft only finished on Friday. It's worthwhile pointing out that Google and Facebook can still have a say about that. And the reason why this has now it's gotten to this draft form is because they weren't playing ball earlier. They basically stalled for months and months while newsrooms shut down.
Sure.
And I think another point that's worth making too is that, they talk about, both Google and Facebook have said, in some circumstances, we're willing to pay for news, which has been a really interesting part of this process for me, because certainly, for years and years, like the ACCC investigation took 18 months, and that has never been made apparent. It's only been very recently that they've made murmurings about paying anything for news. And both of them in these arguments have said that, news outlets in Australia could charge millions and millions of dollars. I actually don't know that that's correct, because the way that the arbitration is going to work is that they both have to come, like both parties, if they can't reach an agreement over money, then they both have to come with their best and final offer, and an independent arbiter is going to step in and decide which one is more reasonable. So I don't think it's like, sending in a demand letter. I think it forces, the way that it's structured forces both news outlets and tech giants to come in with what they think will be a reasonable offer, so that the best can be chosen. It's kind of like a real estate deal, but I don't think it's going to be the rivers of gold and the big scary thing that these billion-dollar companies are actually making it out to be.
So as we said, it's ether o'clock, and my Facebook memories is full of me drinking Dunkel Gold in Berlin and occasionally writing a story. But that means new smartphones and new folding things from Samsung. Alex, what have they unveiled?
So they they teased this when they announced the Note 20 series, and then it almost entirely leaked well before it was officially announced this week. But Samsung's latest foldable is the confusingly named Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 2. And yeah, it's another big folding out tablet to a phone style thing. As the Fold 2 bit might kind of inform you, it's the successor to last year's Fold. So it's a ferociously expensive, but kind of technologically neat in some ways, foldable phone. Now, I'm well known for regular listeners as being someone who's rather passionate about foldables as a category unto themselves. Jen, were there specific parts of the Galaxy Z Fold 2 that entranced you?
I am so excited about this phone. I've not been this excited about a phone in like actual years. This is I think a much more refined version of a folding phone. Like, we saw them last year for the first time. Some of them were a bit wacky. Some of them were almost going to be released and then had major technical issues and needed to be unreleased and then re-released again. I think we're getting to the point now where they could be almost practical, and I'm very excited about that.
Almost practical for quite a lot of money, though.
Oh, look, for quite a lot of money. I mean, these are the folding phones really still are like not quite a proof of concept. We've gone beyond that, but definitely the highest of high end. Like, this is for people like me who want to be Penny from Inspector Gadget, and people who have a lot of money and want to show off in a cafe, if you're actually allowed to go to one, pull out their phone and then all of a sudden make it double in size. So I'm excited because often we don't see companies kind of shoot for that. Like, a lot of companies make iterative changes these days where you get another black rectangle that's, maybe slightly a different size from the last time, has a slightly different camera. This one, bam, it's different and it's used in different ways. And I think the most interesting part of this new device is that Samsung has taken our feedback, as I've told them, Alex, and made changes that were very important, and also thought about how people will use the phone, which they didn't necessarily know the first time around.
I think they knew. It's just that from a technology standpoint, they couldn't quite do it. I guess the biggest change for me is that external display where last year it was kind of a postage stamp, and this year it's a phone.
It's an actual phone. And look, I think that it will still be a smaller screen and a more narrow screen from everything we've seen so far, but it's more usable. Because last year it was very much a first generation device, purely based on that front screen, which was just not very big. I think it was 4 point something inches, which it felt like a throwback to the bad old days of the very early iPhones. Whereas now you get a reasonable size screen. You can actually use it not just to take phone calls, but to do stuff before you open it up and become the big hero because you've got a folding phone.
All right, I'm still struggling to visualize this a little bit. So it opens up like a book. Is it landscape or portrait? How big is it when it's closed and when it's open?
So when you open it up, it's now got a 7.6-inch screen. So they've made some work on the bezels. It's much more fancy looking inside, and it's actually got a glass screen rather than a plastic screen this year, which is potentially very good because the plastic screen, well, it had a few issues, especially if you took any sort of plastic covering that was on.
It wasn't very durable, people.
It wasn't. It actually said in the manual, "Don't get dust on this," and that's concerning for anyone who lives. This model is definitely more refined in that regard, and it's got a bit of an interesting aspect ratio inside. It's a little bit more square, which might be a bit confronting for people. But even like the last one, the shape the last one was really good for reading books and for reading magazines inside. You can definitely do more things with maps and having a look at finer details, for doing multitasking. And they've got some really interesting things around dragging and dropping things onto the screen for multitasking this year. And some of the camera stuff is really wacky, but I like it.
So that's when it's folded open. So it's basically like a 7 and a bit inch tablet in your hand. What are the dimensions of it when you fold it closed? And once you fold it closed, as you're saying, there's a screen on the front?
Yeah, so there's a screen on the front, but it's a bit more narrow than a regular smartphone, essentially. But it still works. It still functions. You can still access widgets and what have you as you want. And then on the back, it's got a little bit of a camera hub because it's got the three cameras in the back of it, much like a Note 20, but not the Note 20 Ultra, because it's not quite as thick as that. It is a thicker phone though, because obviously it's two phones set on top of one another, and so you're going to need the big pants pocket.
So if I'm holding the phone and it's folded closed, roughly what size is it? If it was a normal smartphone, what would you call it?
It's a 6.2-inch smartphone, basically. It's
6.2-inch smartphone.
Yeah, it's just thicker, and as Jen said, it's sort of taller, so it's a little bit thinner as well, which might help a little bit with that pocketability. I was kind of surprised, actually, with last year's model, how I expected, right, this is just going to be an absolute brick in my pocket. And, yeah, I noticed it, but it wasn't that bad, which doesn't sound great for a $3,000 phone, but you you quickly forgot about it, is the point I'm trying to get at. Jen, you mentioned the phone's cameras, and I've got to say this is an area where I'm a little bit disappointed, because when they announced the Galaxy Fold last year, it was with the best cameras they could make, because they announced it around the time of their S series phones, and it was a little bit better than those. But this is coming after the Note 20 Ultra, and at a tech specifications level, this thing isn't better than a Note 20 Ultra. Why would I spend an extra grand on a camera phone that's worse?
Well, because you're essentially getting a tablet thrown in with it. I mean, if cameras are your thing, then this might not be the high-end spec that you're looking for. However, it has some unique abilities. And I really like that they've thought about, and this is part of the thing I was talking about, where they've thought about how people could potentially use it this year. So with this one, they've got some unusual camera modes where, for example, if you've got it open, so you've got the big screen facing you, you've got a small screen on the outside and the camera beside it, you can actually turn on the outside screen so people can see themselves as they will look like in the photo. Now, that might be distracting for them, but if you've got a kid in front of you, they might actually smile at the darn thing instead of, looking and trying to eat their feet. So potentially you could take some interesting photos that way. And there's also a model where you can actually take a photo, again, with it folded out. You can take a selfie of yourself with the back camera, which is, a choice of three 12-megapixel cameras, while still being able to see yourself. And if you were an influencer, that's the kind of thing you'd be interested in. And if you were really bad at taking selfies like I am, then maybe they won't be quite as bad.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing they showed off was this idea that it can be its own tripod because you can have it kind of folded, half folded open, which is a trick that they also had with the Galaxy Z Flip.
And I think they've really learned from that. Like it's an interesting use case too, because it was very well done in the Flip, where they have this hinge where you can prop it up on a desk and it can be kind of half there. So it's good for taking photos, but it's also good if you're watching YouTube. They've got an interesting camera thing where it can actually follow the subject around and make cuts, kind of like some of the security cameras that I've seen, in fact. And I think it'll be interesting to see how people use that, how they can prop it up on the desk and actually, use that technology to kind of go half screen with different apps or watch videos, essentially.
The thing I think that interests me about this more so than the foldingness of it, because it's always struck me that folding and unfolding a phone, it's cool and the engineering is actually very interesting. But once you've done that once or twice in front of your friends, they'll go, "Oh yeah, we've already seen you do that. Was that worth $3,000?" Is the productivity side of stuff, and you were kind of mentioning that with drag and drop. They've gone a bit more all in on things like decks and integrations with Microsoft Office and other ways that this is pushing towards that kind of hybrid tablet / laptop / phone. That's basically what I really want.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. They've had a bit of a trial with the Note as well, because the Note was a big screen until we had almost a tablet screen in our pockets potentially. And I think that they've tried that before, where they've split the screen, but with such a large screen on the inside of this phone, you can essentially do 3 different apps at once. You can also do little flyovers so that you can see like an app that just pops up and you can dismiss it when you want to. There's also drag and drop in this. So potentially if you have to, drag the details of a restaurant, for example, over to a text message window, you can do that. If you need to attach a photo, it can be quite easy. So those are the sorts of things that you could do on this phone that gives Samsung a competitive advantage over a device that just has the one smaller screen. And I think those sorts of things need to be really well done. The software really needs to be ready for that. And Samsung ultimately is responsible for that, because I know that they've brought Google on board with some of their apps, which is very important. But this sort of stuff has to work and has to work across a whole heap of different apps for it to be a really compelling argument to get this phone.
I can hear Steve Ballmer chanting about developers in the back of my head as you say that. But you're right. For a premium phone, though, as well, there's still that sense to me, in a way, that we're still in the early days, because there's a whole bunch of premium phone features which are not present on this device. I mean, it's fixed storage. It's technically sort of single SIM. It's certainly single real nano SIM, but it's also got an eSIM on board. And eSIMs traditionally, well, they've been a bit of a headache, really.
Look, there is that. The SIM thing doesn't bother me as much. They do have there's a fingerprint scanner only on the outside of the phone, rather than on the front screen built in, as we've seen in the past. So that'll be interesting to see how that goes. And also, there's still questions about durability. You really shouldn't drop this phone, even though I think that it is more durable than the last. And they've made big improvements in terms of keeping the dust out of the hinge, which was a concern last time. They show a big presentation about how they put bits of vacuum cleaner into the hinge and also made it much more solid and compact. And I think that's good, but we're still not at the point where you can get a significant amount of water on this thing. And you really need to be making sure that you don't do anything silly when it's in your pocket.
Yeah, the lack of IP-weighted water resistance. Look, I get why it's a big technical challenge, but I think it is a bit of a problem. Last year when I was testing out the Fold, I will admit that I did get one stuck in a sudden shower of rain. It lived. But it was. I was not happy while that was happening. I was running for my car like a maniac and hoping I didn't drop it at the same time. I think they've said this time that it can repel droplets of water. It's slightly better, but I don't know if that's just because of that ultra thin glass screen on it. if that's, anything that's in real world use is going to make a big difference.
So it repels one droplet at a time?
It gives them its marching orders. You, droplet, out.
It's definitely not a phone that you want to dunk in anything. Do not take this to the toilet. Do not drop this in the toilet. Do not drop this in a drink. Do not spill your beer even near
Don't
this
take your phone to the toilet, people. I mean, that's just...
Oh, see, I'm okay with that. Yes, because then maybe I will actually touch your phone if you get a problem. But you said before that, you thought maybe after a few times of opening this in front of your friends, they wouldn't be impressed. I suggest you get other friends if that is the case, because I want to open my phone in front of people and then just like drop their jaws. I think that is an amazing thing to be able to do.
I think the tech is amazing, but it is 2020, Jen. How many large crowds of people are you actually in front of?
Well, I need this phone, you see, because I need to have people who are 1.5 meters away from me be impressed by my phone. And they need to be able to see it, and they can if it's got a 7.6-inch screen.
She wants to show it off at the AFL Grand Final. That's what it is.
I wasn't going to bring it up, but...
What is this AFL Grand Final of which you speak? I'm so confused.
I hear there's going to be heaps of tickets because, no one's that interested.
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Jen for joining us for this week's show.
Thank you.
So if folks want to find your work or indeed your good self on social media, where and how do they do that?
They could find me at Jen Dudley on Twitter or all over the News Corp mastheads like the Daily Telly, Courier Mail, just writing about folding phones and probably a couple of other things.
Excellent. And of course, you can catch up with us on Twitter at verticalholdau, online at verticalhold.com.au, or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page, unless we get classified as news.
And thanks as always for listening to our new sports podcast. Don't forget to tell your friends about us, leave a review and help us spread the good word. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. All right, that's probably a good place to stop.
We didn't have many Victorian listeners, did we, Adam?
No, not many.
We'll have less now.